Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. Welcome to the Vermont Vegetable and Berry Growers Association and Extension Spring webinar series. So my name is Laura Johnson. I'm the pollinator support specialist with UVM Extension, and we're also hosting this webinar today in partnership with the University of Massachusetts Extension and Hannah Whitehead, and I'm just gonna let her introduce herself right now before we get started with the rest of the speakers.
Hi, everybody. So I'm Hannah Whitehead. I'm an extension educator at UMass Amherst, and I've been at UMass for about 3 years. I was focusing on honeybees for the first 3 years, and then this past summer I joined the vegetable extension team, and so now I'm working much more with a focus on helping vegetable farmers and thinking about pollination and native bees and pollinator habitat, which I'm really excited about. And so we did a survey this winter asking growers about the topics that they were interested in, and we got a lot of interest in pollinator habitat. A lot of growers already have pollinator habitat on their farms, which was really great to learn. And so we're thinking and starting to plan educational events for the summer. So keep your ears tuned for that. We're going to be doing some demonstration plots of different types of pollinator habitat at our research farm this summer. So again, stay tuned. And then I'm also going to be giving a talk about habitat this coming weekend at the CMAP conference in southeastern Massachusetts. So if you are excited about what you learned today and want to hear more, you can come to that conference and hear that talk. Yeah, and I'm excited to be doing this with Laura and to collaborate with her. I'm really excited to hear Dan's talk. I've heard a little bit about what he's been doing at his farm, and it's really exciting. Yeah, I'm excited to learn more today.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to be hearing about pollinator habitat plantings, what growers are doing in NRCS funding, and we're going to start with Dan Pratt from Astarte Farm, and then we're going to hear from NRCS-Vermont and Tom Akin and Toby Alexander after that.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm talking about one of my favorite things of all time, which is pollinator habitat. Astarte Farm started working with NRCS on pollinator habitat back in 2008 with the EQIP program, which I always call EQIP, specifically under the windbreak shelter belt establishment practice. Since the farm was already certified organic, a required 50-foot buffer zone had been created within the perimeter of our main field to help shield it from possible neighboring spray drift. Our initial efforts to establish tree lines along the borders were pitifully porous, and the EQIP funding helped the farm to interplant shrubs and flowering plants to create truly substantial hedgerows. By choosing flowering plants from the end of the season sales at various garden centers and even the big box stores, the farm was able to simultaneously create a windbreak, excuse me, to block spray drift and the backbone for pollinator habitat. And just one quick note, I won't say this over and over again, but I always like to say it's a pollinator / predator habitat because there are so many valuable predatory wasps that take advantage of the same pollen sources, nectar sources, and even nesting sites. And they have made a tremendous difference to the success of our no-till, no-spray farm. Okay, so under the windbreak shelter belt practice, Astarte Farm was able to get funding to create the first beetle bank in New England. Native clumping grasses like big blue stem, little blue stem, Indian grass, and switchgrass, along with pollinator attractants like mountain mint, were planted in accordance with the Xerxes Society recommendations as outlined in their book, Farming with Native Beneficial Insects. NRCS programs can not only help pay for the installation and maintenance of pollinator habitat, but programs are also able to compensate the farm for income lost due to conservation practices on otherwise productive land. So it's really a triple win situation for us. In addition to being good windbreaks, the clumping native grasses are ideal habitat for ground beetles who come out at night for predatory raids on pest insects. The pollen-producing seed heads of the different grasses form somewhat sequentially, which helps keep a reliable food source available for beneficial wasps and other pollinators. After 2 years of growth, the tall grasses arching outward can provide dappled shade in adjacent beds for heat-sensitive plants, like a lettuce crop, or the beetle bank growth can be sheared with hedge trimmers into a more pyramidal, compact form without sacrificing their effectiveness. Astarte Farm's biggest block of pollinator habitat was established in 2016 with assistance from both the Xerxes Society and NRCS. Careful solarization had been used to prepare the former 6 production beds. The 3 beds closest to the established evergreen windbreak were planted to perennial flowering shrubs, while the 3 beds closest to production areas were planted in perennial flowers. Flail mowing in the fall and a controlled spring burn every 3 years has provided good habitat maintenance. In addition, a yearly mowing, a partial mowing, if you will, of a sinuous path has helped to spread out the bloom times on the perennial sunflowers. The shorter mown plants flower at least 6 weeks earlier than those left to assume their full stature, and helps to keep the sunflowers from bullying any of the lower growing flowers. The summer growth is pretty apparent here. This is just a shot from, I think, a different side of that wildflower patch. And the diversity of bloom is something we're always looking for. We want to have as many different flower types and plant statures and structures as we possibly can. Now, some people would consider partridge pea and Queen Anne's lace weeds, and I do sympathize with the weed reputation for Queen Anne's lace, but these are actually pretty neat pollinator habitat plants. The partridge pea is a specialist in that it has extra floral nectaries at the where each branch joins the main stem. There's a little hollow that collects nectar in there. And because the umbrella shape of the Queen Anne's lace is great for some of the smaller predatory wasps, we try to leave as much of that growing as we can. We may not like it in the carrot bed, but it's really been very helpful in these pollinator patches. I have some confusion in my notes, which is a good way to start, right? But one of the great side benefits of perennial pollinator plantings is the encouragement of fungal activity on the farm. Particularly in well-cultivated soils, the dearth of fungal life seriously limits the amount of natural fertility that can be unlocked from the ground via the soil food web. Even a single season of undisturbed soil in an annual pollinator patch can bring back fungal life onto the farm, and the benefits get greatly multiplied in perennial plantings. Now, I don't have any real good pictures of this, but I would like to also mention bird life. The pollinator patch and even a pollinator bed that we put out annually seems to bring a great deal of bird life to the farm. And there's been some interesting work done using molecular scatology. And I believe what they're doing is examining the DNA of bird poop on a farm, and they've established that something like 85% of the insects that birds consume are the pest insects, as opposed to the 15% or so of the beneficials. I also wanted to just take some quick talking points from Hannah Whitehead at UMass. who's a specialty in pollinator issues for their extension service. And these were published in the Vegetable Notes newsletter. In the past, native bees provided all pollination services on farms. Only after farms increased size in the mid-20th century were honeybees used for large-scale pollination. We are learning that native bees still provide significant pollination services to crops, and their numbers can be boosted by establishing nearby habitat. The best way to support bees is to increase pollinator habitat, and that would be flowering resources in undisturbed areas on farms, and to use pollinator-friendly pest management practices. And I can attest that on our farm where we had a blueberry patch, we originally had a couple of beehives, and we had almost 100% pollination with honeybees. We ran into a problem with our bee management, and the beehives were no longer in use. And now that we've been doing a lot of pollinator habitat, we have something like 95% native pollinators doing all of the pollination work on our blueberries. And I'm sure that's true for a great deal of our crops. Oh, yes. We've taken so many different sources to establish these plants. These were some willows that were taken from a pussy willow bunch that was purchased at a local farmer's market, and they were left in water. They rooted beautifully, and they have continued to provide some wonderful, very early pollen sources on the farm. In this slide, you can see we have Phacelia, which is the light purple flowering plant, California poppy, which is the bright orange, and I believe it's a wild mustard growing inside a high tunnel. And we really like to just have as many different flowering plants around the farm as we possibly can. When the high tunnel side is rolled up, these plants are abuzz with some of the earliest pollinators that are moving. And by establishing them inside the tunnel, we have them right close to where we can use their predator capabilities. And another thing that we do is this interplanting. This is calendula interplanted under tomatoes. We've classically used basil in the same type of position. So if we get tired of harvesting basil leaves, we can have some flowers there that also help attract insects. And the waste areas on a farm, there's always some place where you didn't get anything planted, or it's not big enough to plant. Here's an example of some pollinator plantings that are just right outside the door to the high tunnel, and you're basically laying out the welcome mat. Come on in here, guys. There might be something for you to chomp on. While this presentation is focused on USDA Natural Resource Conservation Services support for Astarte Farm's pollinator habitat, I would be remiss not to mention the extensive financial support on other farm projects over the last 2 decades. Over $40,000 for 3 seasonal high tunnels, over $15,000 for cropland payments covering 5 years, over $12,500 for windbreak shelter belt establishment, and almost $20,000 for existing conservation activities covering 5 years. And for a small farm, this is a big deal. It's made a tremendous difference to us. I would encourage any growers that might be seeing this presentation to track down their local NRCS rep and find out what's available for your farm. It can be absolutely astounding. And the NRCS's support has really gone a long way to ensuring that we have adequate pollinator activity on our little farm. And that's it for me, and thanks kindly.
Great, thank you, Dan. There's a question in the chat from Sarah that says, when native shrubs form berries, do you find there is a problem attracting birds? that they eat the berry crop?
I haven't had that problem with any of the shrubs that we have purchased. We were trying mostly for native shrubs when possible, but a lot of the big box stores didn't have that. We have way worse problems with wild grapes and good old European bittersweet. And it is a bit of a chore in some of those hedgerow areas to keep the bittersweet and the wild grape from just tearing things down. I mean, they will try to drag a tree down if they possibly can. But we haven't had that problem with the berries on the bushes after flowering. No.
I have a question for you. You showed a photo of the plantings inside the high tunnel. Was there any issue with, like, did it ever get to a size where there was issue with ventilation, or did it compromise any crop growth or yield there, or
We haven't
well under
seen
control?
too much problem, except when we let sunflower volunteers show up in there. And occasionally they will interfere with the roll-up sides in early spring or late fall in particular. There's been, we've done a number of different experiments with interplanting, even with some perennial ground covers that have little flowers on them. And mostly we're pretty happy. I think the one shot of the sunflowers outside the greenhouse, we had to chop some of those down because it was shading that side of the high tunnel a little too well. But it's mostly just sort of common sense stuff. You don't want to leave a plant where it's going to interfere with the mechanics of the house, closing the door. And we are really happy to see as many volunteers coming back year after year. It's been a wonderful thing, and you sort of feel like the plants are growing where they need to and want to grow, which is great.
Some of your pollinator plantings and beneficial insect plantings are perennial. And you mentioned a little bit of maintenance with these creeping vines. What about, is there anything else? Did you initially have to do some weeding before things were established, or what did that look like, and how much time, was it very time consuming or not?
Yeah, we did two different beetle banks. And one we did, the picture I had, I think, was the one that was done with a pre-punched paper mulch. And that one got off to about the best start. I think with the second one we did further out in the field, and it did require a certain amount of hand weeding just to get the natural soil bank weed seeds under control. And I would say it's sort of a 2 or 3 year cycle where we go through these different areas and we look at what's growing. Right now we have some sumac trees going up close to that pine windbreak, and we're not really sure whether we want to allow that to continue along that same line of the perennial sunflowers that were really bullying that patch pretty bad. So we had to do some mowing there. But the cut flower for the CSA, that's a nice source of pollinator attractant, and it doesn't seem to be particularly arduous. I think the worst thing for us was the initial tree planting, where we were just putting little whips out into a 5-acre field, and the grass was quickly out overtopping the saplings, if you will. But some careful mowing and some strategic mulching with some straw bales got us through that trouble, if you will.
Well, if folks think of any questions as we move forward here, please hold on to them, put them in the chat, and we can talk about them at the end also. And I'll just mention that the links that I posted in the chat are for Dan's, for Astarte Farm's website. They have a YouTube channel And there's also a really nice video kind of showing more of this pollinator habitat and beneficial insect habitat on their farm. And then Dan kindly enough provided us with his email if anybody's got follow-up questions. So thank you very much for that, Dan. So from here, we'll move on to Tom and Toby.
So I guess I'll just start talking while you're doing that, Laura. Hi,
Okay,
everyone. My name's Tom Akin. I'm with NRCS in Vermont. I formerly worked in Massachusetts, just down the street from Dan's farm in Handley. I recently relocated to the White River Junction area in Vermont. I'm based in Colchester along with my colleague Toby Alexander, who's going to also be talking this afternoon on some examples of pollinator projects that have occurred in Vermont. So I'm going to start with just some of the basic program details for NRCS. Dan Pratt is an organic, as you said, is an organic farmer in Handley, Massachusetts, and it all starts with a conservation plan. So Dan went to his local service center and worked with the district conservationist and the soil conservationist there to develop a conservation plan, which is essentially an inventory of all the resources on the farm. And through that conservation planning process, the farmer and the NRCS staff identify resource concerns or problems that a farmer might have, and also the opportunities that are on the farm. And the conservation plan is really a menu of best management practices or conservation practices that a farmer can install on their farm to improve their resource base. So it all really starts with a conservation plan. And then once you have the conservation plan in place and you decide, yes, I want to do these specific conservation practices, like for example, pollinator habitat establishment, which is our conservation practice name is called, it's called conservation cover. You can apply for financial assistance programs to address those resource concerns. So there are a number of steps, and I also put a link to this information at the very beginning of the chat. One thing that I also included was a link to farmers.gov, which is the kind of like the online portal for USDA customers to do a lot of the things online to try and streamline the process and try and get as much of the paperwork done ahead of time. But it really does come down to that conservation plan and someone from NRCS coming out to your farm to talk to you about developing the conservation plan and helping you to establish like what your priorities are and what you're really interested in working on, and then applying for financial assistance to get those projects implemented. In Massachusetts and in Vermont and in all states, we accept applications for financial assistance on a rolling basis. So you can go into the office today and file an application if you so choose. The applications are then batched and reviewed on a regular basis, and after the field office and the customer establish all of the eligibility requirements, a lot of that is done through the Farm Service Agency, which is usually co-located in an NRCS service center. But as I said, a lot of these eligibility forms can be completed online through farmers.gov. Projects are selected for funding based on their environmental ranking. So projects that rank higher will be funded first and on availability of funds. And projects that are not funded, farmers will have the opportunity to defer applications to the next funding cycle, which is usually the next fiscal year. So if you're not funded the first time around, it's always good to persist to make sure that if you're really interested in trying to get something that you find important funded. So there's two large programs that Dan mentioned. One is called EQIP. This is the largest financial assistance program that NRCS has. This program is used to fix some of those problems or resource concerns that farmers have on their farm, to help them comply with state and local regulations, or to implement a conservation practice that's going to improve the resource base. For example, improving water quality or improving wildlife habitat. If you're in a priority habitat area, we're doing a lot of projects regarding soil health now. So EQIP is kind of like the big dog. It is by far the largest dollar program that NRCS has, and one that's probably one of the programs that's probably the most popular with farmers. And the other program that Dan referenced that he also participated in is the Conservation Stewardship Program. Now, this program is a program that rewards farmers for good stewardship of their natural resources. It does reimburse farmers for conservation practices, but the payment rates for the conservation practices reimbursed for in CSP are a lot less than they are in EQIP. The advantage to CSP is that the enhancements, which are kind of like taking the conservation practice or the best management practice to a higher management level, are very financially attractive. And so they're usually 5-year contracts. I believe Dan has had at least one CSP contract. In fact, he may even be in a second one now. As I said, the Conservation Stewardship Program is a really good fit for farmers who don't have any large resource concerns or any large problems to deal with. If you're doing a good job managing the resources on your farm, CSP is probably a good fit for you, and you should consider talking to your NRCS folks about that. And then, of course, there's always the fine print. The financial assistance programs are considered taxable income. You will get a Form 1099 from the IRS for the amounts of assistance that you receive through NRCS. So just keep that in mind when you're doing your financial planning, that it is taxable income. And then just lastly, that NRCS staff can't really advise you on any of the tax implications that you receive, and that you should really talk to a tax professional about that. So with that, I'll turn it over to Toby Alexander, our state biologist, and he'll show you some examples of some pollinator habitat projects that have been implemented here in Vermont. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the habitat and conservation management for pollinators. I'm the state biologist and forester for NRCS in Vermont, and I'll just be highlighting some of the things that I think are important to be thinking about when we start planning in and around farms in Vermont. So obviously for pollinator habitat, you need to be thinking about areas for feeding, flowers for resources for pollen and nectar. And that includes obviously transitional areas and forest areas in addition to open lands. Need to be thinking about nesting sites. Most bees actually nest in the ground, and there's also tunnel cavity nesting bees that will nest in snags and or pithy stemmed shrubs such as sumac or elderberry, things like that. Then obviously eliminate and alter pesticide use to protect pollinators. Really a lot like what Dan did there, creating that shelter area between, I assume, a farm that was applying pesticides and his organic farm. So that's kind of exactly what we would do in that situation. And I think from my perspective, I manage a lot of upland habitats for wildlife, which includes pollinators and birds and everything else. I think sometimes folks rush to plant, and I think a lot of times you should definitely take a peek around the farm and the surrounding area to see what you have available, what is providing habitat now, and really learn to recognize that there's a lot of valuable natural habitats around us a lot of times, particularly if you're in an area that's not intensively ag, kind of fence row to fence row type agriculture. You're going to find areas of transitional areas that provide really good habitat, actually. One thing for the plant lovers out there, I know there's plenty, is to really look at what is flowering and when, and what's important to pollinators. So, we really, when we look at planting, we can also use that same thought process when we're evaluating what we have in and around the farm for maybe what is the gap in flowering on that farm. So really we look at early, mid, and late season flowering. And, if we can determine that, maybe we're light in the early season, and that's when, we need to focus on species that flower earlier in the growing season, that would be, really useful information and really make the habitat much better for the pollinators in that area. For those that don't know all the natural plants, that's fine, but that's then you can work at, learn to recognize, and really encourage those high value species that you have in and around the farm. And really, you can do a lot of management just to maintain what's around the farm. And the typical hill farm in Vermont, at least, often has an old orchard that maybe has grown up in parts, and the field edges seem to creep in if you don't maintain them, and you may have a good transition area from the forest, mature forest, to the field, with things like shad bush or serviceberry, and the milkweeds and all sorts of different things, plants that can come in, and then things like the wet spots that maybe have the willow and the dogwoods and things like that are really going to help fill out that growing season for the pollinators. Again, the nesting portion, having those odd areas around the farm, and maintaining habitat features that are going to be good for other wildlife as well. On the right there, we just have a large snag. The larger the snag, the better. It's going to support small species and larger species that den or nest in cavities. So that's the maintaining around the farm, if you can maintain those safely. Then also things like the sumac that Dan was talking about, that can be beneficial. Again, those pithy stem, hollow stem trees that can provide tunnel nesting bees a nest site, but also having snags, brush piles, and other kind of features around the farm, stone walls. I mean, these can all provide nesting habitat for bumblebees that are going to nest underneath things. And these idle areas that have kind of thatchy grass that kind of gets packed down, and these are all areas that can provide nesting sites for bumblebees as well. So when we think about the planting habitat for pollinators, I think you just want to keep the pollinator foraging and nesting in mind for everything you're thinking about on the farm. And it doesn't have to be just in and around where the veggies and fruits are potentially, but to have a healthy ecosystem around the farm and at the margins of the farm are all important. And field edges can provide a lot of really important nesting sites and foraging sites, again, because we have that transitional area where it's not disturbed, and you have more thatch buildup, potential nesting sites. And these can be maintained with simple mowing every few years or something like that, and those can be really valuable habitats and have a lot of good floral resources naturally that we have around New England. And then I'll obviously maintain and improve those valuable shrubs and trees that we have around the farm as well. And that's where we could look at, the funding assistance potentially to make up some of those areas we may be lacking in the floral periods throughout the growing season to make that habitat even better for pollinators and beneficial insects. I should add too, I know Dan talked about that, the beneficial insects, we're using a lot of the same plants and habitats that the pollinators are. So I think the pollinators get a lot of the attention, but the beneficial insects that are predatory and take out a lot of crop pests are going to benefit just as much from a lot of these managements we're talking about. So I think we started to talk about some of the different conservation practices that we offer, and here are just a few. This is not all, I would say, but just a few. There's pasture hayland planting, 512. Not necessarily practice that is always done for pollinators, but there's benefits to pollinators through that practice. So when you're choosing, different types of legumes that may be part of that. I think this project here was just frost seeding in legumes to an existing grass cover. That's going to have benefits to pollinators. The middle one, conservation cover, 327 and wildlife habitat planting are very similar type practices. They're both really about planting kind of permanent cover that's going to be beneficial to wildlife, and really in Vermont and elsewhere, a lot of that work has been focused on pollinator habitat. And this is where you're really deliberately coming up with a planting arrangement and species mix and a good deal of site preparation to get that area to be a really good pollinator and beneficial insect habitat. Field border is another one. Again, this can be used for a variety of purposes, but there are options where you can make it much more pollinator friendly and incorporate a range of things. It could be a very simple addition of a legume just to provide a little bit more habitat benefits for food resource, or it could have much more pollinator friendly forbs incorporated into that and making it much more of a pollinator field border. Another one, hedgerow planting, which is somewhat similar to windbreak shelter break establishment. And that one, again, to have these idle areas, these cover areas, providing additional species on the farm, potentially these transitional type woody plants. These are going to be good habitats for pollinators as well as other wildlife in the right setting. And I should add the riparian buffer and tree and shrub establishment. You'll see the bottom left there. Oftentimes we can really make up for a lack of early season flowering forbs that don't always seem to be there in a lot of places with a lot of these woody plants. So just adding those woody shrubs, things like the shadbush and the cherries, dogwood, the willows especially. Willows are very, very important to bees in the early spring. These are all things that we could incorporate and make up for that early season flowering period that often may be limited in some areas. Then there's integrated pest management, to protect pollinators and beneficial insects for pesticide use around the farm. So that's another thing that we can also work with you on. I noticed some of the field staff on from NRCS-Vermont, they're going to know them. It's like a dead horse, beating a dead horse to me, the early successional habitats. We do a lot of early successional habitat management in Vermont, and it's due to the fact that we have a lot of declining species, grassland birds, shrubland birds, monarchs, pollinators, variety of wildlife use these transitional habitats all the way from the hay field you're seeing there with a nice legume component to that old field that's managed under a mosaic in the upper left-hand corner, really maintaining a complex structure out there that's going to maintain a diversity of different types of plants as well. And that can be done through a variety of types of techniques. There's a call that, there's a little skid steer with a grinder on the front there that can be used to maintain some of those field type habitats. And then we can also work in forest land. And so if you have a mature forest, a beech or maple type forest, if you're doing some even age type management out there on the forest, that can actually provide really important cover, but it can also improve the floral resources greatly. If you're in an area that's extensively forested, that can restart a lot of the raspberries, blackberries, cherries, and a lot of those forbs that may not really be in that area are going to kind of get another chance to provide some habitat for pollinators in those settings. Forestry, forest management, again, thinking about the whole farm, and a lot of farms do have forest land associated with them. Again, there's a variety of different things that we can do that are going to benefit pollinators and other wildlife on the forest stands as well. Again, the pictures across the bottom are kind of black cherry and basswood flowers, and doing things like crop tree release on species that are beneficial to pollinators. And I have seen some foresters doing that. We do offer practices like crop tree management, and I've seen some where they release basswood, and they're not doing that for the timber value, because it really has very little value for that at all. But it's a good pollinator plant. It's also good at bringing up micronutrients into the leaf litter. So there's a variety of different things that managing these old landings that we have, maintaining them as open land. These can provide a good little suite of floral resources and maybe a otherwise forested environment. Just in general, we offer forest management plans to help folks do better stewardship on their forest properties. Again, dead and dying snags, large woody material, all important for different types of wildlife, including pollinators. And then different types of forestry, silviculture, even larger gaps where you're cutting blocks of trees and maybe up to a acre or acre and a half size opening. These are all going to be potentially beneficial to the wildlife and pollinators, because it's allowing some of those flowering woody and forb species to kind of have another chance to have some sunlight at the forest floor. So what I was talking about, a lot of that stuff is through the EQIP program that Dan and Tom are both mentioning. We do have an easement program, wetland reserve easement. We do wetland restoration work, and this would be those sites that have had past hydrological alteration. Either could be land leveling, could be ditching, could be a variety of things. So for areas where maybe the farm is fighting in an area that's just it's wet, but really having a lot of troubles, it may be because it was wetland and maybe still is, but has ditching through it. Wetland restoration program is an option that can provide a lot of benefits to pollinators and other wildlife. And here's just a few pictures of, again, the willow is a really important early season plant for pollinators. Buttonbush in the middle, and prickleweed on the right there. So this conservation reserve enhancement program, CREP, is specific to Vermont. New Hampshire, Massachusetts don't have it to my knowledge, but it's a version of the CRP program that you hear about from out west. There's a partnership effort between FSA and the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, and also the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and NRCS provides technical assistance as well to this program. It's a Farm Service Agency program, which is our sister agency, and this has been a really beneficial program for creating buffers across the state. I think they're upwards of, 3,000 acres of forested buffer in the state. That's a lot of buffers. And a lot of that provides a lot of these early floral resources. Again, thinking about the dogwoods, the willows, and other species that can be incorporated into that buffer. And we've really, since about 2008, and I think that's when Dan was mentioning that, was, that's when pollinators really got on our radar screen a lot. And we went through all of our practice standards and technical materials and tried to highlight those species that were also beneficial to pollinators. And so we're doing a lot of that type of work through the CREP program as well. So if you have areas where you're lacking in buffers, this program, provides reimbursement, basically a land rental, incentive payments, and pays for the trees and shrubs we put in the ground. So it's a pretty good deal for farmers. So the CSP, this is the other program that we talked about, Conservation Stewardship Program. Again, there's many enhancements. So there's kind of two parts. You do enhancements or conservation practices as an activity, and you get a payment as well for all the previous stewardship that has been done on the farm. So that's the payments that we were talking about earlier. But just to kind of close out here, there are a lot of different types of enhancements. Some are focused very specifically on monarch butterfly habitat. Some are, enhancements to field borders, making them wider potentially. Conservation cover to provide habitat for pollinators and beneficial insects. And they have certain requirements. You need at least 9 species, 3 species for each bloom period. So there's some very specific things to follow for some of these, but we've definitely had some landowners take advantage of some of this CSP enhancement activities. Okay, we can take questions now.
Great, thank you. There is a question in the chat from Olivia asking, do you have a list of shrubs and trees eligible for funding assistance for plantings? What is the minimum acreage / size of plants to receive funding?
So we have, we're somewhat, for the most part, we're planting native trees and shrubs. There is some exceptions that can be made for purposes that we really can't meet with that native shrub or tree component, like the windbreak potentially, where we may need to look at some other types of species to provide that purpose. But we do have a technical note as well. I added a biology pollinator technical note into the chat. And I can also add in our trees and shrubs for conservation. We do have a technical note that has a list of all different types of trees and shrubs. It's not a comprehensive list for Vermont, but it has kind of the major species, and it has all the characteristics to help you kind of pick what type of tree and shrub you might want to use based on site conditions. So there's things called drainage class, wetland indicator status, height at maturity, all sorts of different things. You can do filters and pick which species might work best. Minimum acreage, there really isn't. Really it's almost maybe somewhat by our contracting software, which, our minimum size is like 0.1 of an acre. So I think that may be sort of our default minimum size based on the contracts.
Then there is a question here asking from Scott, do honeybees and native pollinators compete?
Well, I'm not a honeybee expert. There's probably people that have a lot more knowledge on that on this call, I'm guessing, than me. I would suspect there's going to be some competition, but there is some compartmentalization of competition just based on the types of flowers and the size of the bees, and there's many different types of native bees out there. But I've seen honeybees and bumblebees feeding on similar flowers together, and I assume there's some level of competition. I really don't know, though. There is some concern that that there's potential to transfer parasites and that sort of thing with having them in close quarters like that. But I'm not really a honeybee expert. I'll fess up.
Yeah, I can chime in a little bit on that, and maybe I don't want to put Hannah on the spot, but she might have a thought on this too. And yes, there is competition, and sometimes it can be beneficial in relation to crop pollination services. There was a study that was recently put out on tree fruit or tree nuts. I forget what specifically it was. If it was almonds or cherries or something, where by incorporating honeybees and wild bees together for pollination services, it made the bees move more often, and which enhanced pollination services in that context. So some healthy competition there.
Yeah, I think you guys both kind of summarized all that I know too, which is that there's a lot of potential ways that they could compete, whether it's competing for floral resources or honeybees could transmit diseases to native bees, but it's really, really hard to study. And I've seen a couple people try and do it, but we just really don't have the data to know what's, either way. It's really hard to have a research project where you exclude honeybees. So yeah.
Great,
I mean, I
Thanks.
think a lot of the focus of NRCS getting so deeply into the pollinator work was really the issues with honeybees and decline and that sort of thing, and really recognizing the benefits of the kind of the backup plan for pollination, all these native bees that we have that provide a lot of pollination services out there, and as long as you maintain habitat for them.
And we are at 1 o'clock. There's one more question I'm just going to throw out there. What is the funding rate for each of the programs?
Well, that's kind of hard to answer. It's they're just kind of different. I mean, I think in general, the programs are not intended to cover the full cost of implementation of the practices, but intended to cover most of the cost of the practices. And, you know, Tom was getting at for CSP, really it's best to maybe try to take care of your resource concerns first, either on your own or through the EQIP program, and then you're better set up for the CSP program, which is, it's really about funding those and providing those that have done conservation some payment for that work that they've done in the past, you know, to maintain that and to then take their conservation to a higher level, adding additional things out there. So that's kind of a complex question. It kind of depends.
Okay. One more comment and then I'm going to close this out here. We get a large number of honeybees from our saffron flowers because they are about the only thing flowering in the October to November and maybe December time frame. So
Oh, wow. Yeah.
awesome. Thank you very much, Michael, for sharing that. So just thank you to Hannah for joining today, to our speakers from NRCS, and to Dan from Astarte Farm. Really appreciate the time and effort everybody put in to making this possible. There's an email in the chat from Toby if you want to follow up with any other specific questions about NRCS and pollinator and beneficial insect conservation practices. So thank you very much, everybody. This again is being recorded. So thank you if you are joining the recording, and slides will be posted as well. So thanks everybody for being here.